Thanks for coming to Unite, and thanks for coming to this talk. I appreciate you taking 30 minutes out of your lunch break to come see this thing. I'm the head of development engineering for PC at Oculus, and what that really means is that I work with developers across all types of developers, smaller ones, indies, all the way up to big publishers and larger studios, to get their content on our store. Um, I'm part of the larger Oculus publishing group, and our job is to get the best content on the store. And we do that by working with developers all the way through the submission process. My background is games. Most of the publishing team has a background in games. My entire engineering team has a game background. So we provide a range of services to titles and developers, from performance deep dives, design feedback, help implementing our SDKs and APIs, all the way through shipping a game. I focus on PC. There's another engineering group that's focused on mobile, and then there's another platform services group. So engineering is split up in three ways like that. There's another group under publishing called developer strategy, which is your more traditional developer relations, account management type of stuff. And they manage the relationships with developers from the beginning all the way through and then after shipping. The third component to the publishing group is the store team. And the store team is who will work with developers, figuring out dates for shipping, setting pricing for titles, etc. So we all three, developer strategy, development engineering, and store team, all work together to get stuff on the store. Just a quick disclaimer at the beginning of this talk. I'm slightly PC biased because I work on PC. Most of the things I talk about today are not going to be PC focused, but maybe a few things. I'm also obviously slightly Oculus biased because I work for them and they pay my paycheck. But everything that I talk about, with the exception of a few things, is just cross VR. So the agenda for today, 4 main topics. I'm going to go just a brief overview of modern VR hardware, where we are, how it works. Some best practices that we've learned from dealing with content coming in over the past year and a half. Some concepts that we see in compelling VR, and sort of some forward-looking future VR thoughts. Modern VR hardware. So, people have been trying to get consumer VR for decades now. It's mostly been research, but it really only became affordable within the past couple years. So affordability is the first component of successful modern VR hardware. That's sort of a loaded term because we're still talking $500, $600, $700 for a high-end PC premium VR headset. Mobile VR is a bit cheaper, depending on how you get the headset. You may get it for free with a phone. You may pay $100, but it's still affordable compared to where we were thinking VR would be 5 years ago. The second component of successful modern VR hardware is high precision tracking. Using, if you were just to use the accelerometer in your phone, that's generally not precise enough to have reliable and immersive VR tech. So current headsets, especially premium headsets, have very high precision tracking, accelerometers, gyros, IMUs, all of that. Also, low motion to photon latency is key. What motion to photon latency is the time between when all the sensors and IMUs and gyros are read to get the orientation of your head. The time between that happens and when photons from the screen actually enter your eye. We try and keep that as low as possible with a variety of hardware and software. We try to keep that between 20 and 30 milliseconds. High refresh rate. The Oculus DK1, Rift DK1 was 60 hertz. The DK2 was 7275. The Rift and other premium headsets are 90. The Gear VR is about 60. Anything below 60 and you lose, your brain just sort of just rejects that it's actually you're somewhere else. So keeping the refresh rate of the hardware as high is key. And motion controllers. Now with the addition of the touch controllers that we shipped last year and other premium headsets having motion controllers, we feel like that's finally a complete platform. There's just a richer sense of immersion when you see your hands or you see your tools or your guns in the game than just some abstraction of a controller that you can't see while you're playing. So on to some VR best practices. These are just things that we've learned, and there's some pitfalls that titles generally hit, and there's some things that are things that we see in polished titles generally. So the first critical thing here is performance. It's like the number one thing to do is to maintain frame rate. If you drop frame rate, your brain loses the sense of immersion, and you drop enough frames and the person gets sick. So we try and never drop a frame. And avoid judder. Now judder is like a stutter in time. If your application cannot generate frames in time for the refresh rate of the headset, it will display the previous frame. So imagine you're turning your head and you turn and you can't generate a frame. It's going to show what was there in the last frame. So it's going to look like you're just dragging the screen along with you. That makes people sick. So we try to avoid that whenever possible. To do that, we have a couple tools called Time Warp and Space Warp. Time Warp will fill in a frame based on the rotational, the orientation data of the headset if your application isn't able to generate a frame. Space Warp similarly works by generating an interpolated frame if your application cannot generate a frame in time by dropping the frame rate of your application down to 45 frames per second, generating that interpolated frame, and then allowing your application to catch up on the GPU. There's several ways to use adaptive quality by dialing down the resolution of the eye buffer as you're rendering to give the GPU some more headroom and allow you to get back to frame rate. And then just one final note about loading screens. We provide several SDK features that allow you to stop submitting frames when you're doing stuff like loading a bunch of data off disk as you're loading a level. And we can put a quad or a cylinder up in front of you that the application does not need to update so that the user can turn their heads and won't get sick. Second thing I'd like to talk about is Locomotion. Early first-person camera, like first-person shooter type stuff in VR was pretty uncomfortable. And the main problem there is acceleration. The reason that acceleration causes problems in VR is pretend you're driving a car in a VR game. You take a turn. You see that you turn, but your inner ear, which determines your balance, your equilibrium based on acceleration, does not feel that. When your visible system and your inner ear vestibular system do not agree, your brain thinks it's getting poisoned, and this turns into simulator sickness or motion sickness or a variety of other things it's called. So we try and avoid acceleration whenever possible and make it instant. So if you're in a first-person shooter type game and you want to move forward, the stick, when you move forward, immediately go to the walking speed or the running speed or whatever. And don't do things like head bobs, because that just makes you feel bad. Head steering is another thing that works well for Locomotion and is very comfortable. Basically use your head as a rudder. Even if you're pushing forward on a stick or a trackpad, whichever way you look, you travel towards. And that seems to be pretty comfortable. Tunnel vision is a very good technique for reducing pixel flow. And pixel flow is the flow of pixels in your peripheral vision. So in flying games, ways that some flying games do tunnel vision is just draw a cockpit. So all the things in the corners of the screen, your periphery, you don't see that, and that makes it more comfortable. Google Earth does a good job of this. As you rotate the world, it brings your focus into a circle and then fades that out, and you just see a grid. It's like the same effect as if you're on a ship and looked out and feeling seasick, and you look out the window and you see the horizon line, and you sort of get your bearings and you feel more comfortable. Teleportation is a really handy way to solve Locomotion. in VR in a comfortable way. Screenshot is from Robo Recall, which is sort of best in class in terms of teleportation mechanic. The basic way it works is you look at where you want to go, and then you push up on your stick or whatever, and then you can rotate it around and fix your orientation when you land. And snap turns. Snap turns are great. It's another example of limiting acceleration. So you hit left or right on the stick, and you rotate 45 or 60 degrees immediately. The easiest way to make someone feel really, really bad is to do a smooth rotation. It's really awful. Second thing I'd like to talk about is hand presence. Now that we have motion controllers on most of the systems, hand presence is a great way to increase the level of immersion. Seeing your hands, seeing your guns, being able to have them track what you actually do is super, super immersive and super compelling. First thing that we see that is generally a problem on titles that come in that haven't iterated on this a lot is registration. What we call registration is where your real hand is, making sure your virtual hand is in the right spot. So if you lift up your HMD, making sure that your real hand is in the same exact spot. Oftentimes we'll see hands that are offset over here, or if you rotate your arm around like this, it actually goes like this. In extreme cases, we've seen that cause people to feel bad. And the reason is because of proprioception. Proprioception is the concept that your body uses to know where all your limbs are, your limbs and extremities, based on all of the different receptors and sensors. And for this case, for this case, this is why a lot of games just show if they show your hands, they don't show your arms, because it's really hard to get arms right with IK. And if you do this and the in-game arm does this, your body's going to get confused and you'll feel bad. The one exception here is usually for like multiplayer avatars for remote players. They will show the full arms if they want to, because there's no disconnect between what your brain sees and what they're doing. Expressive hand animations are like a great way to keep the immersion level high. And with touch controllers, you give thumbs up, you can point, you can wave, all that stuff. And avoid the uncanny valley. This is why most of the time in games on our store, you will not see like fleshy hands, because it feels really weird, especially if they cut it off at the wrist. So putting hands in gloves or like ethereal sort of ghost hands work really, really well. I'd like to talk about object interaction next. Pushing buttons, turning dials and knobs, flicking light switches all feel really, really good. In real life, that stuff is super easy to do. There's not a lot of resistance. So those types of interactions are really, really nice and feel great, and they're very natural. Moving like big levers or carrying heavy boxes or something with weight to it doesn't really feel right, because you see a big thing in front of you, but you don't feel it. So try to keep your interactions with things sort of on a micro scale. Turning physics on hands doesn't work super well, because if there's a table here and you bring your hand down and then it stops, but in real life you're doing this, that feels a little weird. There's some exceptions here. There's a game called Surgeon Simulator, which when you do that, your hands turn into like a ghost. It leaves your hand, your like fleshy hand here, and then turns into like a ghost hand here. So your brain still accepts that as real. And I'd just like to give a plug here for our developer blog. We have a great series on object interaction on our developer blog by Eric Koski. You should check it out. And then finally, there's a few third-party libraries that just do nothing but handle object interactions. VRTK is one of them. They're for Unity. Check them out. They do a great job. Consider your play area. I live in San Francisco. Rents there are ridiculous. The size of the room that I have to play in VR is not going to be the same as like someone who lives in a big barn or a farmhouse or some place in the suburbs. So consider that when you're building your worlds. Consider putting objects close to the player. Also, The Oculus sensors sit on a desk, or most people have them on a desk. So putting things on the floor that you have to interact with can be a problem due to occlusion. Also, most premium VR headsets have some concept of a guardian or a boundary system, and you can query that system for where it is, and you can place your objects within that system just to make sure that users can always get to your objects and interact with them. Spend time on audio. Like I said, I came from a games background, and audio is always like the last thing that gets dealt with, and if it has to get cut, if like there's no audio engineer or no audio designer, that's a regular occurrence. But audio is super important on VR just because an audio cue right behind your head immediately gives you so much because of the positional audio and the 3D audio. So we provide an audio spatialization SDK. You can ship it on Oculus. You can ship it on other titles. It's free to use. It's great. Just works. Just spend some time on audio. It doesn't need, you don't have to spend a lot of time, but just get your positional audio correct. It makes a huge difference. Next thing I'd like to talk about is UI. Making the UI comfortable, something that a lot of PC developers especially have coming over from PC where it's a point and click sort of thing. We recommend keeping, just putting your UI on a quad or a cylinder in front of the user. Cylinders work really well because you can show a lot of it and turn around. It's all right there. We recommend keeping it about a half to 1 meter away from the user. That's pretty comfortable distance to reach out and touch, or you can use laser pointers. Another way to do it is like this title, Medium, which is our sculpting tool. You press a button and it brings up a menu, and it's just physically attached to your hand, and you can just touch it. It's a great way to do it as well. All right, let's talk about some compelling VR content concepts. There's a few themes that we see over and over again on our really high-polished titles, and I'd like to talk about them quickly. First one is over and over again, we see that titles built exclusively for VR tend to be more compelling than titles that are ported over from a flat screen. Here's a great example. This is Lone Echo, Echo Arena. You're in zero gravity. You can fly around with little thrusters on your hands. You can grab people's heads. You have this disc that you're trying to throw into a goal. None of that really would make sense in a 2D flat screen game. There are exceptions to this rule. There's some games that have come over great. Elite Dangerous is one of them. We're in a cockpit, but that game's also great in 2D. There's some things that seem like they wouldn't be super compelling, but they are. Job Simulator, for instance, you can pick up a bunch of junk and throw it around, staplers and coffee mugs. But just picking up a paper plane and throwing it is one of the most fascinating things to do in that game. And it just wouldn't make any sense trying to do that in a flat screen game. Another thing that I'd like to give a shout out to is Rez on PlayStation VR, which is one of my favorite games ever. That game came over and sort of breaks my rule here for building exclusively for VR, but it's almost like that game was designed for VR, 10 plus years ago. But generally, we like to see people build concepts that just wouldn't make sense in flat screen, and those types of things are super compelling. Leverage the motion controls. We're seeing a shift away from gamepad type games. Our touch users are just generally more engaged. They spend more time in the headset. They spend more money in our store than folks who just have gamepads. There's a fairly even level of compatibility between all the platforms and the motion controls, so you can build for one platform and support all of the major platforms. You should tailor to your audience. PC VR and mobile VR are two totally different beasts, at least right now. The PC crowd is more hardcore gamers, so we see most of our titles on our Oculus store are games. There are some other experiences, but it's mostly games. Our mobile market looks and behaves a lot more like classic mobile market, more casual, more passive experiences, slightly less engaged, but much broader. I mean, just a way bigger audience. So as you're thinking about what you're going to target, which platform you're going to target, think about how your experience, your title may fit into those markets. And then just a couple of random points. Established titles and brands and IPs aren't really important to success on VR. You don't have to like have a Call of Duty or something like that to ship your game and to be successful. It's early enough in the process, it's early enough in the ecosystem that there aren't hundreds of thousands of titles out there that you have to compete with. Have a compelling mechanic that will work. Moderate play length. You don't need 100 hours of gameplay. You don't need to sink AAA budgets into your game to be compelling. A few hours, 3 to 10 hours, is generally what we see that works really well. And have an accurate price point. Our store team is really, really good at giving price consultations that will tell you if you're coming in at some crazy price, or that you could get a little bit more out of it if you dropped it or raised it a little bit more. You don't want to go too high, but you don't want to undervalue yourself as well. Finally, I'd like to cover some future forward-looking thoughts about where we think VR is going. Social. Social is huge. Facebook, who now is Oculus's parent company, is putting a huge investment into social. You can download our Facebook Spaces beta app. So basically, you can go and have messenger meetings with your friends, do a bunch of activities in there, sort of a social sandbox that Facebook is using to build, because they really believe that social is the way forward for VR. A bunch of other technologies that go to support social in VR. Hand presence that we've talked about, voice over IP, parties, ways to group people together and make the social experience more compelling. There's a bunch of new tech and research that Oculus is doing in particular to support more social things. You can check our research papers online, things like tracking eyes and such, to make things more expressive and social. We're seeing some early successes with events on Gear VR. Events are a way to schedule regular or one-time activities in VR, and that'll sort of bring people together at a certain time and widen that funnel so there's more people in VR at the same time doing the same activity. Sort of along the same lines as social, multiplayer, we think that's going to be huge for VR as the base grows. It drives the engagement just like social does. Currently, the problem is the number of concurrent users. For this reason, we always encourage people when they're making multiplayer games to go cross-platform. Widen that funnel at the top. Get everybody in your game across all the headsets in your game. You don't want to get into your game and then have nobody in the lobby. Asynchronous multiplayer stuff, things like leaderboards are asynchronous, showing ghost runs for if you have that type of game, any type of multiplayer thing to make it feel more social. And I talked about events. Beyond games. So games are the primary driver, at least on PC right now, but we see a bunch of other opportunities for applications. Productivity tools like virtual desktop, or big screen are great examples of this. There's still some kinks to work out, like how do you operate your mouse and your keyboard, and how do you read text on screen when you've got a lot of it. But we see that pushing the state of VR forward. Entertainment, there's a lot of applications like Hulu and Netflix that are super compelling. It's really cool to put on a VR headset and have a 40-foot television screen right in front of you if you have a dinky little TV at home like I do. There's experiences like museum tours, documentaries, BBC-type content that is super compelling. And then training simulators, something that I just recently found out about. There's a bunch of developers who are making stuff for like people who are learning how to drive a vehicle in a warehouse or figuring out how to put things together in an assembly line. That's my talk. Thank you very much. You can check out our developer blog. You can check out our developer site. You can tweet me dank memes if you want. It's my Twitter handle. It looks like we have 4.5 minutes for questions.
What's some of the best new content you've seen being submitted to the store, and are there any themes you could pick out on new content trends?
I get asked just your second question. We get asked that a lot. Like developers frequently ask us, what's missing? What kind of genres are missing? And we don't really know that. The most compelling stuff that we see is often stuff that we wouldn't imagine. Currently, I don't want to favor one developer over another. There's a lot of good stuff that's coming out now. Let me just put it that way. I think the quality of content in the past 6 months since the beginning of the year has drastically improved. I think folks are really starting to figure out a lot of the components of great VR.
I was just wondering if you think there's too much focus on porting like existing games like that work on PC and work on console, and people are trying to make that work in VR, which like Locomotion is a big thing about. Like teleportation is just what I feel like is not a natural thing in VR. Like the presence is what VR is all about, in my opinion, and you break it with Locomotion. And like where you said Lone Echo is like a good example of people solving Locomotion by 0G. But that's like the first game out there, and I'm like, this is something that would fit VR. The rest has all been, in my opinion, too much like old stuff they're trying to port towards VR.
I don't think there's too much of a focus on porting. I think that developers are doing what they can to be successful in VR, to build an entire engine, build an entire tool pipeline from scratch for a VR title when the audience currently is not super huge. Is pretty daunting and doesn't work out for a lot of developers. So I think taking existing content and porting it over and making tweaks for VR works for some content. It doesn't work for other content. I think a nice blend of existing content with just fresh for VR is what the ecosystem is going to get built on right now. I think 5-10 years down the line, VR content will not look anything like flat screen games ported up.
Yeah, exactly. But aren't you worried that there's too much expectation right now in all the games that are coming out now that everybody's asking what's the killer app? But what's the killer app? But that's such pressure that's building up, and there's not many games that can step up to the plate. Maybe Lone Echo will. Like a lot of hype has been around that. But
I don't think there's going to be a killer app. I think there's going to be a suite of like mini killer apps.
Yeah.
Maybe there will be a killer app, but I think we just really need to sort of build that solid base that will encourage people who are on the fence about buying a headset to say, wow, there really is a variety of pretty fabulous content out there.
Are there any plans for accessories for the Oculus platform? I don't want to say trackers, any other kind of gear you're planning to release probably?
We don't have any public plans for any accessories at this point.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate your time. Thanks.